This is a tiny baby Silver the Hedgehog, and this is him years later, calm, focused, capable of lifting cars and stopping everything around him with the power of his mind. And today, I will show you what happens if you raise Silver as a household pet. I will feed him from a fork, teach him to control his telekinesis, build safe zones for him, train him, take him on walks, and show you the exact moment when everything can spiral out of control. But it didn't start in laboratories or with explosions in the sky. It all began with an ordinary cardboard box left on my porch late in the evening. I stepped outside to check a strange rustling sound and saw it, slightly dented with no name and no address. A soft silver glow was seeping from inside, as if something within was quietly pulsing. The box trembled faintly. I carefully lifted the lid and froze. Inside lay a small silver hedgehog with his eyes closed. His quills were soft and messy, his head seemed too large for his tiny body, and there were already small gloves on his paws. He looked as if he had simply fallen asleep along the way. And the strangest thing, small objects were floating in the air around him. A pencil, a coin, a piece of paper. They weren't falling, they were hovering. At that moment, he opened his eyes, bright yellow, attentive, far too aware for a newborn. He didn't cry, he didn't panic, he simply looked at me, as if trying to decide whether I was safe. Then he quietly sneezed and everything scattered across the porch. That's how Silver appeared in my home. In the first days, he was surprisingly calm. He slept a lot, crowing into a ball on a pillow, and faint energy lightly sparked around him. Sometimes in his sleep, objects would begin to vibrate slightly. A glass trembled softly on the table, books slowly shifted, curtains swayed without any wind. I understood the main rule immediately: safety. I moved heavy objects higher, secured shelves, and hid fragile items, because even in his sleep, his power lived a life of its own. But at the same time, he was still a child, and that's when the strangest part began. Instead of ordinary fruits, I decided to test his reaction to unusual flavors. I prepared small pieces of chili pepper, pickled ginger, spicy radish, a slice of lime with salt, and even a drop of sauce that burns an adult's tongue. I carefully brought it to him on a fork. Silver watched it closely, as if scanning its structure. Then the piece of chili slowly detached from the fork and hovered in the air. He didn't touch it, he simply concentrated. The pepper floated toward him, on its own. I expected him to grimace, but instead his eyes flared brighter. A light wave of energy passed around him, and the air became denser. He swallowed the spicy food calmly, as if it were his natural fuel. From that day on, our morning ritual became unusual. I would offer him something spicy on a fork, and he would practice keeping his power under control. The hotter the taste, the brighter his telekinetic energy flared. Sometimes during meals, spoons, jar lids, and even chairs would begin floating around the kitchen. If he got distracted, the objects would fall. If the spice was especially strong, a silver aura appeared around him, and everything hung in the air at once. That's when I realized that for him, those flavors were not just food. They were a catalyst, fuel for his abilities. Bath time was a separate story. No pools, no equipment, just a large plastic tub. At first, the water would rise into the air along with him. It was as if he didn't understand why he needed to touch the surface. But then he started playing, lifting spheres of water and carefully returning them. He laughed when droplets hovered around his head like tiny planets. And then he would get tired and fall asleep right in the towel. The vacuum cleaner became the funniest discovery for him. He wasn't afraid of the noise. On the contrary, he concentrated on it and began lifting it into the air, as if testing its weight. One day, he literally rode across the room sitting on the vacuum cleaner's body, holding it up with telekinesis. He looked like a little wizard just learning to control the world. In those moments, it was hard to believe that one day, this power would become dangerous. While he was small, he seemed harmless. He watched cartoons next to me, and the screen sometimes flickered from his energy. He played with a ball, not pushing it with his paws, but tossing it with his mind. But even then, I noticed his gaze sometimes became too serious for a child, especially after another portion of spicy food. In those seconds, the air around him began to vibrate slightly, and I felt that one day, this quiet silver power would become something far greater. Over time, I realized that his power was growing faster than he was. Spicy food stopped being just an experiment. It became part of his training. A small piece of chili meant light concentration. Ginger meant holding several objects at once. A truly burning sauce meant completely stopping everything moving in the room for a few seconds. He wasn't just learning to lift things, he was learning to hold them perfectly still in midair, without a tremor. And if at first only light objects floated up, within a couple of weeks he was holding an armchair, a coffee table, and even the refrigerator, all while calmly sitting on the floor and looking at me as if it were just a normal game. I had to completely redesign the house. I cleared one room and turned it into a training space. I removed everything unnecessary, reinforced the walls, installed soft panels so that if something fell, it wouldn't shatter. We started simple. Lift one ball and keep it perfectly still. Then 2, then 10. Then I began throwing objects toward him, and he had to stop them an inch away from himself. And at some point, I noticed he wasn't just stopping them, he was sensing their trajectory in advance. His eyes would narrow slightly, and the object would freeze before I had even fully released it. But along with control, his personality was growing. He became more independent. If before he calmly ate from a fork and waited for the next piece, now sometimes the food would float toward him before I even reached out my hand. He didn't do it out of defiance, it simply became easier for him to live that way. Easier to control the world directly, without intermediaries. One day, the first alarming moment happened. I accidentally dropped a glass. It should have shattered, but it froze in midair. And not just froze, it began slowly rotating, the glass creaking softly as if under pressure. The room became unnaturally quiet. Silver stared at the glass with unsettling concentration. His aura grew dense, almost visible. And only when I calmly said his name did the glass gently lower back onto the table. In that moment, I understood. If his emotions ever slipped out of control, the consequences would be serious. One day, a car sped past us too abruptly. A loud sound, a flash of headlights, and the car lifted slightly above the road for a fraction of a second. Just a little. Then it gently settled back down as if nothing had happened. The driver didn't even realize, but I did. His reaction had become faster than thought. He liked evening walks, less noise, less movement. He would stop and stare at the sky for long stretches. In those moments, streetlights would begin to flicker faintly, as if electricity itself wavered under his influence. I started noticing that his power affected not only objects, but the very energy around him. Even his games changed. Ordinary toys no longer interested him. A ball was too simple, so I made it harder. I launched several objects in different directions, and he had to gather them back into one point without touching them. At first they were blocks, then metal spheres. Then I added a timer. Each time he finished faster. His movements were minimal, almost invisible, but the air around him thickened when he concentrated. Sometimes, after training, he would sit in the corner of the room and stare at a single point for a long time. Objects around him trembled slightly even without visible effort. His power began manifesting on its own, like breathing. It no longer required strain. And one day, I decided to test the limit and gave him a sauce hotter than usual. He swallowed it calmly. A second later, everything froze. The clock stopped ticking. Dust in the beam of light hung motionless. The sounds of the street became muffled, as if the city were sealed under a glass dome. He wasn't just lifting objects, he had slowed everything around him. A chill ran down my spine. This was no longer training, this was a level I wasn't ready for. When he blinked, the world snapped back into motion. Sound, air, lights, everything returned to normal. And he simply looked at me with an expression that mixed exhaustion and confusion about his own power. That evening, I sat beside him for a long time, watching him sleep. His silver aura shimmered faintly in the darkness. He was growing. His gaze was becoming deeper, more serious. There was a sense of the future in him, as if he could feel events that had not yet happened. And with each passing day, I understood more clearly the house was becoming too small for him, not physically, but energetically. And very soon, we would have to move on to the next stage. The next stage began abruptly, without warning. In a single moment, I realized he was no longer small, not in height, but in energy. The house literally stopped coping with his presence. Spoons would stick to the walls if he got angry. Books flew off the shelves if he laughed too loudly. One day I slammed a door, and every window cracked at once, as if pressure had been applied from the inside. He wasn't even looking at them. It was happening on its own. I moved the training outside. No cages, no restrictions, just open space and distance from fragile things. I laid out concrete blocks, real weight. Silver stepped out, looked at them, and didn't even strain. One block rose, then another, then all of them at once. They began circling around him like satellites, perfectly synchronized. He didn't smile widely, but in his gaze there was a calm understanding of his power. I threw a metal pipe toward him. It froze an inch from his face, slowly rotated and gently settled back onto the ground. I made it harder. I started throwing several objects at once: stones, boards, metal parts. Everything that flew stopped. But this time, something different happened. He didn't just stop the objects, he stopped the movement around them. Leaves falling from a tree hung suspended, dust in the air froze. Even the sound of the wind became muffled, as if someone had covered the space with an invisible dome. It lasted only a second, but I understood. He had learned to slow down space itself. Then irritation appeared in him. Not anger, boredom. Ordinary tasks no longer interested him. He began experimenting on his own. He lifted an old metal barrel and compressed it into a sphere without a single touch. The metal crumpled like soft foil. Another time, he lifted a piece of asphalt and gently set it back down, as if testing whether he could alter the structure of the world at will. I gave him something spicy again, the hottest sauce I could find. He swallowed it calmly. His eyes flared brighter than usual. The ground beneath our feet trembled faintly, and suddenly, the entire yard rose several centimeters into the air. Not rocks, not objects, an entire layer of earth. Silence followed, then everything dropped sharply back into place. We started going farther, into open space beyond the city. There, he truly began to accelerate. He lifted dozens of tons of soil, formed craters, created platforms out of thin air, and hovered above the ground himself. He learned to lift his own body with the power of his mind, to fly. But the higher he rose, the harder it was to land. One day, descending, he lost concentration. A wave of energy rippled across the ground, and the shock knocked out several street lights along the road. The lights went out, darkness fell. He wasn't scared, he was angry. The air began to vibrate. Stones started crumbling on their own. A metal fence bent into an arc as if pulled by a giant magnet. His aura grew dense, almost white. The pressure in the air became so intense that my ears rang. This was no longer a game. This was power exceeding the limits of training. I calmly said his name. 1 second. 2. 3. The stones fell. The metal straightened. The air became normal again. He was breathing heavily, not from exhaustion, from emotion. And that was when I finally understood. His abilities were directly connected to his inner state. The calmer he was, the more precise the control. The stronger the irritation, the greater the destruction. And this was not yet the limit. He was only entering the age when power stops being an experiment and becomes a choice. And I could feel it. Ahead, there would be a moment when that choice would become decisive. So more time passed, and his energy stopped being just powerful. It became dense, tangible, like the pressure before a storm. The air around him always felt slightly heavier, grass bent without wind, small stones sometimes trembled at his feet. And it—
What is that? Silver incoming! Ah! Yes! Bye!
It was during this period that the one who always attracts motion and chaos appeared. First, I heard a sharp gust of wind, then I saw a flash of blue light slicing across the field. He stopped a few meters away from us, light, fast, confident. Sonic looked at Silver with interest, almost with a challenge. Silver didn't smile. He simply looked back.
Nowhere to run, Silver! Not a chance!
Sonic moved first, or rather, he disappeared. He launched forward, leaving a vortex of dust behind him. A moment later, he was already behind Silver. But Silver didn't even turn around. He merely lifted his palm slightly, and the space around him grew dense. Sonic froze in midair for a split second, as if he had collided with an invisible wall. Dust hung motionless, grass stopped swaying, sound cut out. Sonic smirked, and with a sharp burst broke free, slicing through the telekinetic field with sheer speed. He circled around Silver, creating a ring of wind. The ground beneath them began to crack under the pressure. It was pure dynamics, speed versus control. Silver lifted several massive stones and hurled them into the vortex. The stones collided with a blurred blue silhouette and shattered into gravel. Sonic changed trajectory every fraction of a second, pushing off the breeze, accelerating even more. Silver closed his eyes for a moment, and the field around him expanded. Everything within several meters became heavy, viscous. Sonic flew into the zone and for a second lost speed. That was enough. Silver caught him in midair, holding him at eye level. The air trembled from the strain. The ground beneath them sank. A metal sign nearby bent as if pulled by invisible cables. But Sonic didn't give up. He didn't struggle directly. He tensed, then suddenly relaxed, and his speed began pulsing in waves. The space within the telekinetic hold became unstable. Silver increased the pressure, but the speed didn't push forward. It spread outward in a circle, disrupting the field. The next second, Sonic broke downward, rolled across the ground, and struck with such velocity that the air exploded with a dull shock. Silver was thrown back, but he didn't fall. He hovered, stopping his own momentum. Now both of them were serious. Sonic accelerated to the limit, turning almost into a continuous blue streak. He attacked from different angles, trying to break Silver's concentration. Silver rotated with the field, intercepting strikes, deflecting them with waves of telekinesis. Every impact created a shock wave that made the ground tremble and small stones scatter. At one point, Silver rose higher, his eyes flashing silver. The entire section of ground around them began lifting in layers. Stones, chunks of asphalt, debris, everything shot upward. Sonic kept moving, but the space around him grew denser. 1 second, 2, and Silver completely froze him in midair. Silence fell. Even the wind stopped. Sonic was breathing heavily, held within the field, but there was no fear in his eyes. He did the same thing again. Instead of resisting, he changed the direction of his impulse. His speed didn't strike forward, it spread outward along the perimeter of the field, destabilizing it. Silver's concentration wavered. That was enough. Sonic broke free, slammed into the ground, and created a shock wave that shattered the telekinetic hold. Both of them were thrown in opposite directions, dust rising in a column. They stood up at the same time. No smiles, no mockery, only respect. Speed couldn't fully defeat control. Control couldn't completely stop speed. They looked at each other differently now, understanding limits and possibilities. This wasn't hostility, it was a test of strength. But I could feel it. This was only the beginning. If they meet again, when Silver grows even stronger and learns to hold his emotions under perfect control, their collision will no longer be limited to cracked earth and rising dust. The consequences will be far greater.
After I raised Silver, I thought I understood everything about power. I saw how a small silver hedgehog could grow into someone capable of stopping space itself. I fed him from a fork. I learned control alongside him. I built safe zones when his energy began to thicken the air. I witnessed how control could become a weapon. But one thought wouldn't leave me. What if I raised someone who doesn't stop space, but breaks it? Not cold calculation, not a dense force field, but pure physical strength. A strike that doesn't slow things down, it punches through. That's when I decided to repeat the experiment. Only this time, everything would be different. If Silver taught me control, the next one would have to teach me how to withstand an udar. And that's how Knuckles entered my life.